Picture the modern world for a second, not as a map of countries, but as a map of supply chains. The phone in your hand, the fuel in your car, the medicine in your cabinet, the movies on your screen, the container ship docking at a port, the credit card payment that clears in seconds, the satellites that guide planes and track storms, even the rules that decide what counts as legal trade and what counts as sanctions. So much of what feels like everyday life is quietly shaped by American business. Not because every product is made in the United States, and not because American companies always win in a fair contest, but because over the last century America built something deeper than a collection of corporations. It built the architecture of global commerce. It built the financial plumbing of the dollar-based system, the logistics mindset of mass production, the marketing machinery of global consumer culture, and the institutional framework, alliances, treaties, and multilateral organizations that protects trade routes and stabilizes markets. American power isn't only a fleet on the ocean. It's also a contract enforced, a loan issued, a standard adopted, a factory financed, a technology licensed, a currency trusted, and a corporate strategy that ripples outward until it becomes normal. If you've ever wondered why American companies can feel present everywhere, or why the United States can influence events on the other side of the planet without firing a shot, the answer often begins with business, not as a side effect of power, but as one of its main engines. But it wasn't always this way. For a long stretch of American history, the United States was not the headquarters of global capitalism. It was a nervous young republic trying to avoid being swallowed by old empires. Early American leaders feared the politics of Europe like a contagious disease. George Washington warned the nation to steer clear of permanent alliances, not because he wanted America to be passive or small, but because he wanted the country to survive long enough to grow strong on its own terms. In that early worldview, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were not highways to global leadership. They were buffers, protective distance that allowed a fragile nation to develop its economy, expand its territory, and consolidate its political system without getting dragged into the endless wars of great powers. American business in that era was largely domestic, tied to farming, local trade, and the slow construction of national markets. The ambition was continental, not global. The project was to build a country first, not to manage a world. And build it did. Between independence and the mid-19th century, the United States expanded across the continent through negotiation, purchase, conflict, and conquest. That territorial growth was not just a political story. It was a business story, because every new stretch of land meant new resources, new markets, and new opportunities for investment. As the country tripled in size, it began to develop an internal economic logic that would later support global influence. Vast agricultural production, growing industrial capacity, and the transportation networks needed to connect them. The oceans still shielded America from Europe's wars, but they also waited at the edges like doors. Once the United States became strong enough, those doors would open outward, and business would be one of the first forces to walk through them. After the Civil War, American economic growth accelerated so dramatically that it transformed the country's relationship with the world. Coal production soared, rail track mileage exploded, and by the 1880s the United States had surpassed Britain as a leading producer of manufactured goods and steel. That matters because steel is not just a commodity, it is the backbone of modern power. Steel builds railroads, ships, factories, bridges, and weapons. It makes possible the kind of industrial output that can supply both domestic prosperity and military expansion. Yet even as America grew wealthier, the nation still hesitated to involve itself deeply in foreign conflicts. Americans had learned to distrust entanglements. But business has its own gravity. When a nation's economy becomes large enough, it begins to demand secure access to resources, stable trade routes, foreign markets, and political influence abroad to protect investments. Even if the public prefers isolation, Commerce pushes outward because profits depend on predictability, and predictability often depends on power. This is where the story begins to shift from America avoids the world to America shapes the world. And it happens through a sequence of turning points where business interests, strategic fears, and military decisions intersect. In the early 1800s, the United States still faced threats from European empires that controlled territory in the hemisphere and profited from it. American leaders increasingly viewed the Americas as their backyard and sphere of influence, and the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was an assertion that Europe should stop meddling in the region. At first, Europeans largely dismissed it because the United States lacked the power to enforce its warning. In 1820, America was a small slice of global GDP. But over the century, the power balance shifted as European empires weakened in the region and America industrialized. Technology, steamboats, railroads, factory machines, turned the United States into an industrial society with growing prosperity. That prosperity fed expansion across North America, and expansion fed the confidence to look outward. Long before America became a global superpower in the mid-20th century, it practiced smaller forms of coercive economic diplomacy. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Japan with U.S. naval power and forced the opening of diplomatic and trading relations, ending centuries of Japanese isolation from the West. That moment matters because it reveals a pattern. American business and American force often traveled together, with military presence serving as the hard edge behind commercial access. And in the years that followed, the United States acquired its first overseas territories, small islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, driven by something almost comically specific, guano, seabird droppings used as fertilizer. It's easy to laugh at that detail, but it illustrates a deep truth about empire and commerce. Strategic expansion often begins with resources and logistics. Guano mattered because agriculture and business demanded it. And once a nation starts acquiring far-flung points on the map for commercial reasons, it begins building the habit of overseas presence, bases, stations, legal claims, and the idea that American economic needs justify American reach. Then came 1898, the year that turned American business influence into a new kind of global force. The Spanish-American War is often remembered as a short conflict, but its consequences were massive because it pushed the United States into the role of overseas imperial power. In the 1890s, influential Americans argued that U.S. geopolitical influence should match U.S. economic strength. Congress approved battleships capable of competing with other great powers, a sign that industrial production and naval strategy were becoming intertwined. The war itself, triggered amid disputed causes, inflamed by the explosion of the USS Maine, and justified by appeals to support Cuban revolutionaries, became an opportunity to remove Spain from the Caribbean and Pacific. In months Spain was defeated, Cuba was pried loose, and territories like Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico became U.S. possessions. Hawaii was annexed the same year. Seemingly overnight, the United States held territory spanning 10,000 miles. That wasn't just a political expansion. It was an economic and commercial expansion. These territories offered strategic ports, coaling stations, and access to Asian and Caribbean markets. They provided a physical network that American merchants and warships could use. They also provided a preview of a problem that would haunt America's identity. The United States began to look like the very European empires it had once opposed, ruling over people without granting them full rights or congressional representation, extracting economic concessions, establishing military bases, and shaping local industries to suit American interests. The resistance in the Philippines, where a bloody insurgency cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives, revealed another reality of business-backed expansion. The world is not empty, and people do not automatically welcome being opened or developed by a foreign power. The backlash at home, the anti-imperialist movement, showed that Americans were divided about whether overseas control was compatible with their ideals. But the larger shift was irreversible. By the early 20th century, the United States had a powerful navy, a vast industrial base, and overseas positions that let it project influence beyond its borders. The United States could now protect commercial interests with force, as it did in 1900 when it sent Marines to Beijing to help suppress an uprising that threatened foreign commercial interests. In this phase, American business began shaping the world not primarily through consumer brands, but through the strategic integration of trade and military presence. Yet even after 1898, America did not instantly become the permanent manager of global affairs. Presidents like Taft and Wilson turned away from outright expansionism, and Wilson kept the United States out of World War I for years. The country still carried an instinct toward distance, neutrality, and domestic focus, but the pressures of global commerce and security began to make that stance harder to maintain. When Germany sank U.S. ships and threatened American lives and business interests, and when the Zimmermann telegram suggested that Germany might support Mexico against the United States, isolation became riskier. And beyond security, money mattered. American banks had lent huge sums to the Allies, meaning the outcome of a European war could directly affect the stability of American finance. Here you see a key mechanism of how American business shapes the world. Financial exposure becomes political pressure. When U.S. capital is deeply tied into foreign outcomes become domestic concerns. War becomes, in part, a business reality. When the United States entered World War I, it didn't just send troops. It stepped into the role of major power capable of influencing the post-war order. Wilson's vision, self-determination, dismantling imperialism, collective security through a League of Nations, was idealistic, but it was also a sign that the United States was beginning to imagine itself as a system builder rather than a distant observer. Even though the U.S. ultimately did not join the League, the episode mattered because it revealed a new possibility. American power could shape global rules. That is precisely how business influence becomes world-shaping. Businesses do not merely sell products. They flourish inside systems of rules, trade norms, security guarantees, monetary stability. When a country can influence those rules, its businesses gain an advantage, and the world begins to operate inside frameworks that reflect that country's preferences and strengths. After World War I, the United States turned inward again, especially as the Great Depression struck. Neutrality acts and protectionist policies reflected a public exhausted by war and wary of foreign entanglements. But global economic life cannot be sealed off forever, and by the late 1930s, the world's instability began to threaten America again. Even before U.S. entry into World War II, American leaders supplied the Allies with loans and weapons, trying to tilt the war's outcome without committing troops. This again reveals the business-power connection. Supply and finance can be forms of influence. When America lends, ships, and manufactures for allies, it shapes the balance of power. Yet the public still resisted another overseas war. That changed in an instant when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The attack unified the country behind war, and the United States mobilized on a scale never seen before in its history, sending millions into service and producing war materiel at extraordinary volume. Here, business, industry, manufacturing, logistics became war-winning power. American factories, shipyards, and supply systems did not simply support the military. They were the backbone of Allied capacity. Business and government merged into a national mobilization that demonstrated something the world would never forget. The United States could produce at scale, innovate quickly, and sustain long campaigns across oceans. When World War II ended, the world did not simply enter peace. It entered a new structure, and American business was central to building it. The United States emerged with unprecedented global power, a massive military, a booming economy that nearly doubled during the war, and the world's most valuable currency, the dollar, around which other major currencies became fixed. In contrast, Europe's economies were shattered and Japan's was cut in half. This difference in economic position is the foundation of America's post-war business influence. If you control the strongest currency and the largest economy, you don't just trade, you set terms. You become the place capital seeks safety. You become the market others want access to. You become the producer and lender that can restart broken economies. That is the pivot point when American business begins to shape the world at a systemic level, not just through expansion or war, but through reconstruction, finance, and institution building. The United States made a choice after World War II that defined the modern era. It did not retreat back behind the oceans. Instead, it resolved to rebuild Europe and Japan, and to construct an international system that would prevent another collapse into depression and total war. The Marshall Plan was not just aid. It was an investment in stability that also created markets for American goods and aligned Western Europe with American economic and political systems. Rebuilding Western Europe's armies and forming NATO created a security umbrella under which commerce could recover. This is a core mechanism of American business power. Security enables trade. Markets do not flourish in chaos. They flourish when shipping lanes are protected, when borders are stable, when currencies are predictable, and when investors believe contracts will be honored. The United States, through alliances and military commitments, helped provide that stability, and American business benefited from it while also reinforcing it. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural relationship. When the United States commits to defending a region, it creates conditions under which trade, investment, and rebuilding become possible, and American companies often become major participants in that rebuilding. In Asia, the occupation and reconstruction of Japan turned a former enemy into a major economic partner. And again, you see how American influence reshaped global business patterns. Japan's recovery was not only a humanitarian project, it was a strategic economic project in a world where the Soviet Union was expanding influence, and China had undergone a communist revolution. The United States built alliances in Asia and demonstrated willingness to fight in Korea to resist communist expansion. Military commitment again acted as a stabilizer for capitalist development. Over time, this produced a broader result. Regions under American security umbrellas tended to integrate into U.S.-led economic systems, with trade patterns, financial flows, and business norms that reinforced American leadership. Perhaps the most world-shaping business decision of the post-war period was the creation and leadership of international institutions. The United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were not just diplomatic clubs. They were the scaffolding of the liberal world order, a system designed to govern international security and monetary policy, promote cooperation, and reduce the likelihood of another catastrophic breakdown. When the United States champions these institutions, it is not only acting as a benevolent leader, it is also shaping the rules under which global business operates. Loans, reconstruction, development projects, currency stability, and crisis management all tie back into these institutions. And because the United States had unmatched economic weight and the dollar's central role, American preferences often influenced how these systems worked. This is how American business shapes the world in its most profound form, not only through products and brands, but through the very conditions that make global commerce possible. From this point on, American business influence becomes a kind of invisible infrastructure. It becomes the air the global economy breathes. The dollar functions as the world's primary reserve currency, which means international trade, debt, and investment often revolve around American financial decisions. U.S. markets become central to global growth because access to American consumers and American capital can determine whether foreign industries thrive. American corporations expand globally, bringing management practices, marketing styles, and technological standards with them. Even when manufacturing moves abroad, the design, financing, branding, and logistics often remain tied to American corporate systems. And because the U.S. security network protects sea lanes and underwrites alliance stability, global supply chains often operate in an environment where American power is a background assumption. People don't see it in their daily shopping, but it shapes the cost of shipping, the reliability of trade, and the confidence of investors. Yet this influence is not uncontested, and it is not always welcomed. The same structures that create stability can be perceived as domination. Territories acquired after 1898 experienced U.S. control without full rights. Post-war institutions can feel, to some countries, like systems where the rules are written by the powerful. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial controls can turn the dollar system into a weapon. This is why American business influence is inseparable from politics. Businesses thrive under predictable rules, but when the rules are linked to U.S. power, other nations ask whether the system serves everyone or primarily serves American interests. The debate over America's role, leadership versus imperialism, partnership versus hegemony, often comes down to the question of who benefits from the system and who bears its costs. Even within the United States, the role of global leadership is debated repeatedly, especially after costly wars or economic shocks. America has always oscillated between outward engagement and inward skepticism. After World War I, the nation withdrew. After the Great Depression, it pulled back again. In recent decades, as new global threats emerge, China's rise, climate change, pandemics, cyber conflict, democratic backsliding, Americans again question whether the burden of leadership is worth it. Some argue that the United States benefits enormously from shaping global institutions and protecting global trade. Others argue that the costs are too high, that alliances drag America into conflicts, that global commitments hollow out domestic priorities, or that American business gains do not translate into broad prosperity at home. This argument matters because it reveals a key truth. American business shapes the world not only through what it does abroad, but through what Americans decide their country should be. The world order built after 1945 was not automatic. It was a choice, repeatedly renewed, and it can be altered if the United States chooses a different path. So when you ask how American business shapes the world, the answer is not simply because American companies are big. Size is the visible part, the part you can measure in market capitalizations, quarterly earnings, and the sheer number of products stamped with familiar logos. But size is the outcome, not the origin. The deeper answer is that American business grew inside a geopolitical transformation that turned the United States from a protected continental power into a global system builder. And once a country becomes a system builder, it does not merely compete inside the world economy. It helps define the rules, the infrastructure, and the assumptions that make the world economy function in the first place. American business gained global reach because industrialization gave the United States the capacity to mass produce, because wars forced the nation to mobilize at scale, because post-war reconstruction and Cold War strategy built alliances and institutions that stabilized markets, because the dollar became the central reference point for trade and finance, and because the United States paired commercial expansion with a promise, sometimes sincerely pursued, sometimes selectively applied, of a global order based on cooperation, security, and rules. That is why American business shapes the world not only when it manufactures, sells, and invests, but when it builds supply chains that become global arteries, when it exports standards and technologies that become global habits, when it influences policy through investment and innovation, and when it operates under a security architecture the United States helped create and still largely underwrites. In other words, American business is powerful not only because it produces things, but because it operates inside a world where the background conditions of modern commerce, relative stability of sea lanes, predictable finance, enforceable contracts, and widely shared economic institutions have been deeply influenced by American decisions since 1945. The most dramatic way to understand this is to see American power as a three-layer system, not because the number three is tidy, but because the layers explain why influence persists even when headlines change. The first layer is visible and immediate. The world's largest economy, the global corporations, the trade flows, the investment networks, the brands that spread into everyday life until they feel like part of the environment. This is the layer most people think of when they think American business. And it is real. It includes the presence of U.S. firms in technology, finance, entertainment, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and consumer goods. It includes the cultural power of American marketing and the way American companies have often turned products into lifestyles and lifestyles into global aspirations. But this visible layer depends on a second layer that is less discussed in everyday conversation, the strategic layer. This is the layer of overseas bases, naval power, alliances, military assistance, and the ability, sometimes used, sometimes merely implied, to protect trade routes, deter aggression, and respond to crises that could disrupt global commerce. Businesses, especially those that rely on long supply chains and global shipping, do not thrive in a world of persistent instability. They thrive when sea lanes are open, when choke points are secure, when regional conflicts are contained before they become global disruptions, and when investors believe the future will be predictable enough to justify risk. The United States has played an outsized role in providing that strategic environment, and even when people argue about whether American interventions were wise, it is hard to deny that the American security umbrella has been one of the conditions under which global trade expanded so dramatically in the post-war era. The third layer is the most invisible but perhaps the most important, the institutional layer. This is the dollar system, the web of international organizations and agreements, the rules of trade and finance, and the shared assumptions about contracts, debts, insurance, crisis response, and the legitimacy of certain economic norms. American business operates in all three layers, sometimes as the beneficiary, sometimes as the driver, often as both. And because the United States has been central in building those layers since 1945, American business influence has a unique global reach that does not vanish simply because one company falls or one election shifts the mood. The institutional layer is where American influence becomes almost gravitational, because once the world is organized around certain systems, changing those systems is slow and costly even for those who want change. Consider what it means that the dollar is central. It means major commodities are often priced in dollars, that global borrowing frequently depends on dollar liquidity, that central banks around the world hold dollar-denominated reserves, and that financial crises often become global crises through dollar-based channels. This does not mean the United States controls the world like a puppet master. It means the United States sits at the center of a financial architecture that many actors depend on, and that dependence creates influence. American interest rates, banking regulations, and political decisions can ripple outward, shaping the cost of borrowing in distant countries and the stability of markets far from American voters. For American companies, this centrality is an advantage. They can raise capital in deep and liquid markets, operate with a currency that is widely accepted, and often transact internationally with less friction than companies from states whose currencies are less trusted. But this advantage also comes with responsibility and risk, because when the dollar system becomes a tool, through sanctions, export controls, or financial restrictions, it can motivate other countries to search for alternatives. The paradox is that using the system as leverage can strengthen American power in the short term, while encouraging long-term attempts to weaken that centrality. This three-layer structure also explains why American business shapes the world, even when manufacturing happens elsewhere. The smartphone in a pocket might be assembled in Asia with components sourced from multiple countries, but its design standards, software ecosystems, financial backing, and brand power can be American. The global logistics firms and shipping insurers that make modern trade possible operate under rules and financial systems deeply shaped by U.S.-led post-war institutions. The entertainment content that shapes global culture is often produced by American studios or distributed through platforms based in the United States. Even when competitors rise, they frequently compete inside standards and markets that were shaped by American pioneers. That is why American influence can feel like infrastructure rather than propaganda. It can be embedded in how transactions clear, how intellectual property is protected, how corporate governance is understood, and what kinds of risk are considered acceptable. The more the world adopts these norms, the less American they appear, because they become simply how the world works. And that is often the final stage of influence, when your way of doing things becomes so widely normalized that people stop noticing it has an origin. As we look at the world today, it's clear that the system America built is under pressure, and the nature of that pressure reveals the difference between a country that merely competes and a country that built the arena. China's rise challenges U.S. economic dominance and offers alternative trade networks and institutions. This is not just a contest of GDP numbers. It is a contest over standards, supply chains, and the terms of global integration. When China builds infrastructure abroad, offers financing, and expands trade relationships, it is not merely selling goods. It is creating dependencies and influence, much as the United States did through its own post-war investments and institutional leadership. Democracy is under strain in many places, which threatens the political assumptions behind the liberal world order. That matters for business because liberal economic systems often assume a degree of transparency, legal reliability, and predictable governance, conditions that can erode when politics becomes unstable or authoritarian. Climate change and pandemics reveal how interconnected and vulnerable global supply chains are, exposing the fragility behind the efficiency. Technology creates new forms of competition, from semiconductors to artificial intelligence to cyber warfare, and these are not simply commercial sectors, they are strategic domains. Whoever controls advanced chips, secure networks, and AI capability shapes not only markets but national security, which means business and geopolitics are more intertwined than ever. At home, Americans debate whether the benefits of global leadership justify its burdens, and this domestic debate is not a side note. It is central to the future of American business influence. The post-1945 system required public support for alliances, for international institutions, for overseas commitments, and for a degree of global responsibility. If Americans decide that global leadership is too costly, or too entangling, or too disconnected from their own prosperity, the political foundation of the system weakens, and with it the architecture that supported American businesses' unique global reach. The future of American business influence will therefore depend not only on corporate strategy, but on national choices. Whether the United States invests in its own industrial base, whether it maintains alliances and trade agreements, whether it continues to lead in international institutions or retreats from them, whether it can manage domestic inequality and political polarization well enough to sustain outward engagement, and whether it can compete in the technologies that define the next era. Because the harsh truth of global influence is that it is not static. Systems decay if they are not maintained. Institutions weaken if they are not supported. And leadership, if taken for granted, can be replaced by another power willing to pay the costs. This is why the question of American business shaping the world cannot be answered only with success stories. It must include the vulnerabilities that come with being central. When you are the hub of global finance, a crisis at home spreads outward. When your currency is the global reference, your domestic political dysfunction becomes an international concern. When your companies dominate technology platforms, the world reacts not only to your innovations but to your regulations, your court rulings, your privacy debates, and your political pressures. When you provide security guarantees, allies depend on you and adversaries test you, and both expect consistency even when American politics swings between engagement and skepticism. In this sense, American business influence has always been intertwined with the credibility of American governance. Markets can tolerate many flaws, but they cannot tolerate unpredictability forever. The stability of the American system, legal, financial, political, has long been one of the reasons investors and partners trust American leadership. When that stability is questioned, the influence of American business does not disappear overnight, but the long-term trend can shift. And yet, it would be a mistake to frame this moment only as decline or replacement. Systems do not vanish just because they are challenged. The American-built global order has adapted before, surviving shocks, crises, and transformations. The question is whether the United States continues to adapt and renew the system in ways that keep it legitimate for others as well as profitable for itself. That legitimacy matters. A world order that is perceived as serving only one nation eventually generates resistance. A world order that provides real value, security, stability, growth, creates buy-in even from those who resent the leader. This is part of why American leadership after World War II was so powerful. It wasn't only that the United States was rich and armed. It was that the United States, for a time, used its position to build systems that others could benefit from, even if unevenly. Reconstruction aid, open markets, institutional cooperation, and security alliances created a framework in which many countries rebuilt, grew, and integrated. That history does not erase later controversies or mistakes, but it helps explain why American influence endured. It was tied to a system many actors found useful. If you want one clear takeaway for your viewers, it is this: American business does not shape the world only through what it sells. It shapes the world through the system it helped build, through the way money moves, the way goods travel, the way wars and peace affect markets, and the way rules are written and enforced. The United States began by hiding behind oceans to avoid foreign entanglements. It became powerful by building a continental economy that could supply itself, innovate, and mobilize. It stepped overseas in 1898 and learned the costs and temptations of empire, discovering that commercial reach and military presence could expand influence but also produce backlash and moral contradiction. It hesitated, pulled back at times, and then entered world wars that forced full-scale mobilization, proving its industrial capacity and demonstrating that economic production could decide global outcomes. And after 1945, it made a choice that changed history. It chose not to retreat, but to lead, to rebuild, and to design institutions that would govern global security and finance. That is the moment American business stopped being merely American. It became global architecture, embedded in the post-war order the United States sponsored and defended. This point is worth lingering on, because it explains why American business influence is often misunderstood. People see the surface, the brands, the movies, the tech giants, the Wall Street headlines, and assume the story is simply cultural dominance or corporate greed. But the deeper story is that after World War II, the United States became the main guarantor of the world system in which modern business thrives. It helped create a framework where currencies could stabilize, where reconstruction could be financed, where trade could expand, where disputes could be managed through institutions rather than constant war. This framework did not eliminate conflict. It reduced the frequency of certain kinds of catastrophic breakdowns and created space for economic growth. American businesses became powerful inside that framework, and their power in turn reinforced the framework, because successful businesses produce tax revenue, innovation, and political influence that support the state's ability to lead. This is a feedback loop. And once a feedback loop becomes global, it creates a kind of path dependence. Many countries and companies adapt their strategies to the system as it exists because the cost of opting out is high. That is why American influence can persist even when the United States makes unpopular decisions. The system is larger than any one policy. It is a structure that shapes incentives across the world, but that does not mean the structure is permanent. Systems survive when they evolve. The post-war liberal order is facing a world that looks very different from 1945. Multipolar competition, technological fragmentation, climate-driven disruptions, demographic shifts, and a public increasingly skeptical of globalization. The question is not whether American business will disappear. It is whether American business will continue to set global terms, and whether the system that supported that dominance will remain widely accepted. If the United States adapts by investing in domestic resilience, maintaining credible alliances, updating international institutions, and managing technological competition responsibly, American business influence may remain central even in a more competitive world. If the United States withdraws, fragments its alliances, politicizes its institutions beyond repair, or allows internal dysfunction to undermine credibility, the world will not stop trading and innovating. It will simply do so through different hubs and different rules. And this is where the story becomes less about pride and more about realism. American business shapes the world because it is tied to American power, and American power shapes the world because it is tied to American choices. The oceans that once protected the United States from entanglement no longer function as barriers in a globalized economy where crises cross borders in days. The same interconnectedness that makes American businesses global also makes American stability a global concern. In a sense, America cannot fully return to the old isolationist dream without paying a steep economic price, because the country's prosperity is now intertwined with global systems it helped build. The real question is not whether America should be involved, but how. Whether it will lead by building partnerships and institutions that others trust, or whether it will try to enforce outcomes through raw leverage, which can be effective but also breeds resistance. So the final line of reasoning is this. The world's economy runs, in one way or another, through systems the United States built, and American business is one of the main forces that keeps those systems alive. That reality is not purely glorious and not purely sinister. It is structural. It is the result of a century of decisions, some idealistic, some self-interested, some tragic, some visionary, that transformed the United States into a global system builder. And that is why American business shapes the world in a way few other national business communities can. It is not just selling into a market. It is operating inside a world where the market's basic architecture, security, finance, institutions, and norms has been deeply influenced by American leadership. Whether people love that fact, fear it, or want to change it, it remains one of the central realities of modern history. The question now is what kind of architecture comes next, and whether American business and American policy will help build a future that remains stable enough, fair enough, and resilient enough for the world to keep buying into it.